Hello, I'm Marcus Railton, and welcome back to the second series of the ScotsCare podcast. ScotsCare is the only charity dedicated to helping disadvantaged Scots in London through a range of support, including financial grants, advocacy, counselling and sheltered housing for older Scots, job coaching, social events, befriending, and support for children and families. The charity's been running for 400 years to help break the cycle of poverty experienced by some Scots. In the new series, I'll be chatting with guests from all walks of life, from celebrities and authors, athletes and actors, business entrepreneurs to academics, all with one thing in common: Scots heritage. And they enjoy a good blether. This week on the podcast, I'm joined by the author Carse Wilson. Chris had some gremlins in his computer when we first tried to record this interview. I actually thought I'd been stood up, but then we managed to sort things out. Chris has written a book called Fray, a superb first-person thriller of a novel that has been described by Alan Cumming as beautiful, amazing, and mesmerising. High praise indeed, and I couldn't agree more. It actually took Chris 4 years to write this book. He wrote it in secret, in 15-minute chunks, while he was on the bus to work. He didn't even tell his wife or his daughter he was writing it. We talked about why that was. We also spoke about Chris's lifetime obsession with running. I could do with some of that. And the place that exercise plays in keeping him mentally healthy. Chris very openly spoke about receiving an autism diagnosis when he was in his 40s and how that changed his life and helped him understand a great deal of what had gone before. We chatted about that, and kids, and education, and perhaps how education needs to change a wee bit to help our own children. So here we go, with the author of Fray on the ScotsCare podcast. Please welcome Carse Wilson.
ScotsCare.
I was actually thinking about you the other week when I was running, because I've read several times that you are a runner, and I like to say running. I was chasing my 15-year-old on a beach in Wales, and I kind of thought, I'm in my early 50s now. I kind of thought, I've still got it. I can catch him, and I couldn't bloody catch him. And
it's probably a moment that comes to us all, but
and it was like he didn't even look like he was. Honestly, Chris, he didn't look like he was trying. He was just coasting, and I kind of opened up to full throttle, and that was about 5 weeks ago. And I don't know what I've done to my ankle, but I'm still limping up the stairs. It looks swollen. But I mean, how long have you been a runner for? Have you run all your life?
Yeah, so I have run for it's more than 30 years, because I did a thing when Fray, my novel, came out just last year. With Runner's World, actually. So they've been publishing in the UK for 30 years last autumn, and very kindly they sort of put two and two together and put me in like a special. It was just about various different people who'd run for that amount of time. So yeah, I would have been 11, 12 when I started, and I'm sort of 30 and a little bit years on now. So yeah, it's been a real constant, and it's a brilliant thing. I mean, it's whether you're trying to chase people on the beach or whether you're doing something entirely different, I think it's nothing really but positivity. Yeah, Chris,
what age are you now? Because I'm always fascinated about getting older and staying fit.
So I'm 43 now, and definitely, it's interesting when you run for a long time. It's in your 30s and 40s, it changes a lot, and I think I've had times through illness or just through working too much probably, where I slipped with the running and was out of it for a little while. And, there's I found at least a real danger of coming back and imagining that at 35, 45, whatever it is, that you can still do what the 15-year-old or 20-year-old you could do. So it's interesting. It shifts and it changes over time. But I think I've certainly found a different way of looking at it, something that's more relaxed, something that's less competitive, and there's something very rich in that, something I enjoy a lot.
I think that's a good thing about edging, and it's taken me a long time to get to that point. Is it's like I'm exercising for myself rather than for my
Mm,
ego anymore,
yeah.
and thinking for years and years I cycled, and I think even in my 30s and 40s, I thought I was probably still a challenger for the Tour de France. I'm not. I'm a slightly overweight man cycling around Surrey, but now if I go for a run or if I get on my bike, I enjoy it a lot more because I don't have my
Yeah.
little bike computer worrying about how many watts I'm putting out or anything. I can actually enjoy it, and I think that's a real step forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I probably did something quite similar around well, it would have been the first COVID lockdown when, the world turned upside down very, very quickly. I really fell out of running. I probably had a couple of months where I was almost totally inactive. And when I came back into it, I stopped running with a watch. And it's a very basic thing, but having timed myself and, worried about those numbers for a very, very long time. Something incredibly freeing about saying, okay, the measure of whether I have a good run today isn't speed.
Mm.
It's not whether I'm faster than the person I am with or somebody you randomly see in the street or during a race or whatever. There has to be a way each run is enjoyable. Each run is a success. And then it just comes down to actually, why are you doing it? What is the level of enjoyment? And I think I was probably stealing that joy for myself for a long time because you look at the watch and like, oh, I wasn't as quick as last week. And somehow that invalidates the effort, the pleasure you're taking from it. As I think with any form of exercise or whether it's sort of solo team competitive or not, the the value of it extends far beyond the moment when you're doing it, and that's what I love about running. Is I ran this morning before we had this conversation because I knew I would be calm, I knew I'd be settled, I knew I just feel better, and it seems ludicrous that we put a watch on and we put numbers on a thing and we say, oh, actually, well, that wasn't worthwhile, or that was a failure. It's a
Yeah.
misery of our own making, and it's to be avoided.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that phrase. There's a way to steal your joy. I think for a while I used an app called Strava,
Mm,
and I think many people have heard of it. And I would measure my cycles, and then I would get phenomenally disappointed because in some random stretch of road in the arse end of Surrey, nowhere, I'd still be the 800th slowest person down that road.
mm,
And as you said, that's no good for you. It's not a great measurement. And you've spoken a lot about the connection between running and exercise and mental health. And that resonated with me because if I can get
mm.
out on my bike at a lunch hour, or even if I take my daughter to school on the back of my bike, now I've got a little seat thing, and just getting 5 miles under my belt, you come back ready to combat the day. There must be something that goes off in your brain that
Yeah,
makes me feel a lot better.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I'm really interested in, what's the connection between being physically active and how much we enjoy life, how open you are to, well, resilient is, I mean, it's a overused and probably misused word, but how strong you are as a person, how prepared you are to deal with the sort of the everyday challenges that everybody faces. But there's also just the something about, when I talk about these things, I'm always interested in the idea that running is, it's not just a physical activity. I mean, it obviously is that. And you're right, it does something to your body, you changes your blood chemistry, you feel different after it, and that's a wonderful thing. But I'm really interested in the idea, and I see running very much as a creative act. So when how I feel for a run is not how I feel afterwards. I've built something, I've changed something in me, and it's cumulative. Over time, if you don't need to throw yourself into these things. You don't need to do ludicrous amounts of exercise. You don't need to run every day or anything like that. if you're steady and you're patient and you exercise a couple of times a week in whatever form of that you enjoy, you're building something up. You're building yourself into a different and often, I would think, calmer, happier, more compassionate person, somebody that's probably much nicer for others around you to be around.
Oh, definitely,
Um,
definitely.
and I think the thing it does for me as well is when I talk to various people about this, because I write that, some people say, oh, when you're out running, are you thinking through a plot? Are you coming up with an idea? And it's absolutely not that. It's the complete opposite. When I run, everything's gone. It's a silence, it's a stillness. There are thoughts that come and go, but you don't. Well, personally, it might be different for others, but at that point, I don't care. I'm becoming, the more I run, the more detached I am from that kind of everyday churn in your mind and that worrying or working things out. But when I come back, if I was stuck in something in a piece of writing or a personal challenge, whatever it might be, invariably I'll probably worked it out, and not through thinking it, just through coming back and being different in that moment, probably more open, probably more relaxed. But I love that. There's a great, I think it's one of these modern challenges in this age of smartphones and how you could be constantly working in a sense. We're working at social media, we're working at God knows what. We're addicted to our attention being drained away from us. That actually stepping away and it's not doing nothing, you're doing something, but giving your brain that space is valuable. And I think as a modern society, increasingly, it's probably something we're losing.
Yes, I spoke to several people about that actually, because I worry constantly about my kids. Anyway, I've got three kids, and I've got a 15-year-old who's faster than me. I've got an 11-year-old he's very creative, but he's always on his phone, and I've got a 6-year-old daughter. But the two older lads, they're always on the screens, and we try
Mm,
to limit the screen time. And I think my older boy Noah, as a result, has a shrunken attention span. He
yeah.
struggles to watch a movie or a football game or anything that's 90 minutes or 120 minutes because he's so stuck on these kind of doom scrolling 15 to 20-second Instagram or TikTok videos. And he had I can't remember if it's a PlayStation or an Xbox. And when you can see the aggravation within him when he plays a lot of gaming, and then I took it off
Mm,
him. And within 48 hours, he'd actually forgotten because he's a good kid. He'd forgotten about this thing,
mm.
but you could see his mood change, and he becomes a much calmer person, and he doesn't feel, and he sleeps better, and he's a nicer person to be around. But I do worry because even in school, all the homework's done on the phone or all the homework's done on a
Mm.
tablet. So the amount of screen time kids are getting these days, it can be good for your mental health.
I think it's a huge challenge, and I think one of the things, I mean, many people have spoken about this, and I'm sure it's something that, well, we all worry about. Your listeners will worry about it as well. I I think part of the danger, and there's a lot, but part of the danger is assuming that technology is neutral. So look, I used to a previous life I worked at a wonderful university, Abertay University in Dundee. It was the first place in the world that taught computer games technology. People who create Grand Theft Auto and Lemmings are
Wow.
associated with it. Like this incredible history of creativity, and it's this hub of this amazing kind of cluster of sort of independent games companies in the city today. And I love that world. I think it's brilliant. But the problem is, we have these phones. We have generations of kids now who don't know the world without it. I think the iPhone was late 2000s that it came along. We at our age remember not having it, and we remember the difference. They're thrust into this world. It's all they know. But I think the challenge for me, and so come back in a way, I suppose, to the thing about running and measuring or cycling or whatever your sport is, who are you doing that for? What's the value there? So, if you've got a smartwatch and it's giving you data, if you're an elite athlete, that's fantastic. If it's adding something to your life, brilliant. I think the problem with particularly social media and other sort of technologies that live in our smartphones and, as you say, are kind of burning away at our ability to concentrate, is the fundamental driving factor behind their existence is to make money for the companies that create them.
Yes.
It's not to make our lives better in any way, shape, or form. They are there to cannibalize and to take your attention. And I think I share your worry about kids. I mean, we've got a daughter just in high school. We probably held out on, I don't know if she's the last or certainly one of the last kids in our class to have a phone. We were really careful and cautious about it. But I think it's really difficult because think about the what I do and what I love to do, which is write. The time it never mind reading a novel a couple of hours, for a very small one, and infinitely growing from that for much bigger work. But the time it takes to write a novel is years. And the
Yeah.
amount of attention that is required to do that is massive. What it means to have your attention micro sliced into these tiny bursts, and what that means for what people create, consume, want, how we as a society think, react to each other. I mean, it's hardly a new thing to comment on the turbulence and the aggression on social media, but it's everything's too quick. I think that's the thing. Everyone's too quick to react to things. And come back to the point about running, which connects again to writing, that creativity. I mean, I don't run with a watch, but I definitely would never run with a phone. And I've only done it if I'm somewhere remote and there's like a safety issue attached to it. The idea that I'm checking an app on my phone, but then something else could be pinging my email or social media or whatever, it's just rough. We all need space, enforced space, and that's the thing, you have to enforce it upon yourself and upon your kids, I suppose, to teach them how to do it. But we all need to enforce breaks from it. But that is very, very hard to do, and we find it hard to do. Absolutely.
ScotsCare, the charity helping to break the cycle of poverty some Scots find in London.
Let's talk about Fray. Now, like you said, reading a novel takes a long time. Writing a novel, is it right? It took you 4 years to write it.
In the first draft, it took 4 years to write, and then there was a bit more afterwards to for the publishing things. End to end was 6 or 7, but the first version was 4 years. Yeah.
Can you give us for anyone who doesn't know? I mean, I demolished it. I thought it was a fantastic book. Can you introduce us to the plot?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book opens with a father who has fled to the Highlands after his wife has just died, and their grown-up child is sort of desperately trying to find where the father is. So in the father's grief, he's convinced that his wife isn't dead. The narrator finds an abandoned cottage, sort of deep in the Scottish wilderness, thinks the father's there, thinks that they've discovered where he's run away to. But all they find in the cottage are thousands and thousands of paper notes in which he's detailing his various attempts to try and find his dead wife, who, as I say, he's convinced is somehow not dead, that she's in the mountains and that she's in the wind and the weather and the light, and that she's there to be saved and brought back. So it's all about mental health fundamentally, but also about how it can deteriorate. So the book is playing with how, our connections to reality and how they can be challenged, how they can be severed. And none of that gives anything away. That's all just the first few pages. But I suppose the premise of the book is, will the father be found, and how will those two parallel stories unravel of what he's looking for and what the grown-up child is looking for as well.
Is it true, or is it? I've read a lot of interviews in the last couple of days with yourself, and one of them said that when you initially decided to write the book, you weren't really thinking about getting it published. So is that true? Or so were you writing it more of a kind of exercise?
Yeah, it's totally true. And it's possibly even slightly more extreme than that. You know, when I was writing it, you know, it wasn't even that I didn't have an intention to publish it. I didn't have an intention to show it to anyone ever. So for me, I'd written seriously, you know, I've always written. It's probably about the same time I've run. You know, it's probably from that kind of, probably even longer actually. Writing was probably 7, 8 onwards that I've been fascinated in stories and creating. Come back to that idea of creating something that we talked about with the running. But from my early 20s, I made a sort of a commitment to myself that, you know, whatever I did, I had no sense of what a career or anything would look like after university, but whatever I did, it would involve writing in some way, and I wanted to create through words and through language. So from then on, I was pretty seriously trying to write and trying to create things in secret. I didn't show my work to people. People didn't know I was doing it. And then fast forward to it was 2016 when I started the book. And at that point, I just was struggling with my own mental health, which has been a theme throughout my life. And I just made the decision that I wanted to finish a book. I just wanted to write something from end to end as a challenge, you know, in the same way you might say, right, I want to run a marathon. I want to train up. I want to do something that I don't know if I'm capable of doing it, and it will be difficult, but there will be a great sense of achievement. So it was, for me, fundamentally, I suppose it was, you know, an audience of one. And then the thing that's come up in various media interviews and, you know, with the BBC took an interest and had me did a thing for the telly with me and all the rest of it is, I suppose, two parts of it. One was that writing for those 4 years was done on my bus to and from work. So these tiny little 10, 15-minute bursts. And the other bit is, you know, when I say no one knew, you know, my wife didn't, and my daughter didn't even know until that first draft was finished 4 years in. Because, I know, so I suppose part of that's insecurity, but it's also, you know, about what was the motivating factor. So I wanted to write this because I felt it was important. In a sense, felt I kind of had to do it. It was a real, you know, exercise. You say that's it's a very good word. There's an exercise in addressing my own mental health challenges through fiction. And I suppose I didn't know if I'd finish it at a basic level, but I couldn't have probably dealt with the pressure of somebody else saying, oh, how's that coming along? When I was going through quite, you know, an existential process of like, God, can I do this? Is this awful? You know, am I writing absolute terrible trash? Which, you know, look, is entirely possible, but apparently, well, some people think otherwise. So yes, maybe that wasn't the case.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was going to say to you, that's quite a big secret to keep, you know, from your daughter and your wife. And I don't mean that in a kind of duplicitous way. I just mean not to come home and go, oh, do you know what, the guy's going to do this, or I think it's going to twist that way, or. But I see why you've done that, because if you say, you know, you don't know whether it's any good and you don't need the pressure, but the reviews have been fantastic. And how did it, I keep on seeing the name Alan Cumming attached to it as well. So he gave you a very glowing review. How did that happen?
Yeah, no, Alan has been, I mean, it's surreal, frankly. He's been generous beyond any words that I have. So my day job is at V&A Dundee, so the Scotland's Design Museum, only V&A in the world outside of London. Amazing, wonderful, wonderful place. And I started working there back in 2016 when the building was being built. And, you know, I think there's something about being involved in a entirely new organization, entirely new building, all of that, in creating something. I think actually that probably gave me and living in Dundee, knowing friends who are creating games companies who are, making things that didn't exist before they started. There was something in that of like, I really want to do this thing. I'm involved in a ridiculously ambitious project to create a design museum. Actually, maybe I should commit to this. Maybe I should get on and write. And then one of the joys of being there and working there is very occasionally, wonderful people like Alan Cumming come to the museum and come to see the fantastic exhibitions and things. So we got to know each other a little bit through a few things that he came to see. And I sent a proof copy of the book, not thinking I mean, God knows how much stuff somebody of that level of, that the world loves, and that level of creative achievement, how many people are asking him to endorse anything, everything. I sent a proof copy thinking it would never get looked at. And then a couple of months later, I got a message from him saying that he loved it and he just thought it was amazing. And I'd driven from Scotland down to Manchester. I was going to see my publisher. I had a big meeting like the day after the drive about the book coming out into the world. And I got the email just at the end of kind of driving through and parking up. And I just sat in the car and I just cried. And it was like, that moment of somebody who's got this vast, diverse creative career who loved and admired for so long, seeing your work and actually connecting to it. I mean, it's still absolutely, I mean, it's a few years on now, but it's still absolutely baffling to me. But I'm beyond grateful.
1 in 4 of us will experience a form of mental illness in our lifetime. ScotsCare offers mental health support with quick access to qualified therapists for both children and adults, more quickly than the NHS. For drug and alcohol addiction, we offer a specialist psychotherapy service. If you're a low-income Scot in London and could use the help, get in touch with us.
The book is phenomenally sensitive in that, and I don't mean that, I don't want that to take away from the pace of the book, because I felt as if it still cracked on. But when I was looking through it and when I read it, it's the kind of like the melancholy and the grief that kind of hit with me, and this kind of sense of loss that you managed to capture. And the reason it is like my parents are both passed away and my brother passed away very young, and you managed to, within your writing, very accurately sum up a lot of my feelings. And I just wondered where that came from for you. Was that based on your own sense of loss?
Yeah, and I'm sorry to hear about your own experience there. I think it comes from a few different places. For a long time, I've been trying, before I started writing this book, I had been trying to put down, on a page what mental health experience feels like. And I think there's something there, as a society, we're getting better at talking about it. Actually, this is the sort of the flip side of a conversation earlier about the evils of social media. One of the benefits of social media is it's a platform where people speak honestly about many of these challenges, and actually there's a great value to that. But the creative challenge I had is how do you put into words how something feels on the inside, particularly when, as somebody experiencing a mental health crisis, whether it's grief, whether it's depression, anxiety, anything else, particularly when in that moment you might not have the words to articulate what's happening. We all will struggle to say, here's how I feel. And that's both about the complexity of that moment and the intensity of it. But I think it comes back to that point about society, that the more we talk about these things, the more we can develop language around them. And I think that was probably what ultimately pushed me from I'm writing this for myself to tentatively showing my wife to, everything that kind of progressed from there, that decision to try and think about what publishing would look like is if I can articulate something that connects to people, whether they've experienced a mental health crisis or not, then there's a huge value to that. But to come to your question, I'm very fortunate. My parents are still alive, my siblings are still alive, but we all suffer grief at different times. I think my starting point was other family members, older family members, grandparents, people who we've lost at different moments, and seeing how, in moments of, grief is a horrible, awful experience, but it is something that we all have in common. Sadly, we will all experience, the age we are now, then, as you get older, it becomes far, far more likely to happen and to happen more regularly. And I think what I was drawn to, and the creative challenge I was drawn to, is because we share grief, and we've literally physically share it. We have funerals, we have moments where we come together and we talk about grief, or at least sit in a church or a chapel or somewhere else and listen to somebody else talking about grief. And it kind of struck me that there's both a language around it. So that's kind of a starting point for thinking about how do you then write about and describe other mental health challenges. But there's also a commonality to it. So if it's something we all experience, then actually that's a starting point, I think, to bring people into a novel to then talk about what mental health means in the rest of your life when you're not grieving, and to then talk about more persistent problems people might have, or more underlying things that exist. So yeah, I think that was the start with it, is that thing that we all share. Then, as you're saying, the balance and the no, I don't want to say trick, but the difficulty at least is how do you then attach a narrative to that? How do you give it a story? How do you give it something that propels it forward, rather than it being static as a book? So those are the two things you're always trying to connect, always trying to keep together.
Yeah, I never felt that you were just defining grief for me. While I thought it was, but even though maybe it's because you have written most of your life, even though this is your debut novel, I still felt it was phenomenally plot driven. But at the same time, did capture that kind of leaden feeling of doom that you can get when you struggle with your mental health. But at the same time, I know this is almost like a juxtaposition. You're still moving it on at a pace.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think there's something there about, I suppose, probably the type of writing and narrative that I'm interested in, that I'm drawn to, is propulsive, if that's a good word to use there, that really does push you forward in some way. That as a reader, you have a clear sense of, you don't know what's going to happen, but you know where you're going, you're being pulled along. And I definitely wanted people to feel that they were really sort of chasing through the book. So, I've had a few people say they sat down and read the whole thing in one go, which is, I don't think I could. Well, I have done that proofreading it. I don't think I would do it. I don't think I'd recommend it, but there's an intensity of experience to doing that. But I think it also comes down to choices about how the book's put together. So one of the things that I was very keen to do is the book is all written in the first person. So it's very much, you are in the head of the narrator, and you're in the head of their father, who, as we said, is convinced his dead wife isn't dead. The other point is that almost all of the book is in the present tense. So what I was wanting a reader to feel is that they are there inside the head of either of the two people who are narrating it, in the moment that it's happening. So that was also part of the decision, talked about the narrator being, the child of but grown up, and that's pointing towards the fact that they're not named, they're not gendered at any point in the book. That we have a sense of, where they grew up and their background and things, but I was really interested in removing barriers to people or really literally putting themselves in that position. So, it's not quite that the reader is having that experience, but there's a really interesting creative challenge about how do you pull someone as close as you possibly can to having the same experience that the character is having,
which is ambitious on your part.
Them. Yeah, I mean, it's ambitious might be a polite word. It might be ridiculous. I don't know.
It's like, Chris, you've lost your mind. That could have gone horribly wrong. That's what I meant.
It absolutely could have. But I think, again, come back to why I was doing it. I wasn't doing it for anybody else, and I certainly wasn't. But what that does is it frees you of the worry of, am I doing this right? And I think probably where in the preceding 15 years or so of writing things and being really committed to writing, but probably, if we're totally honest, writing mostly bad or very bad things, is that kind of apprenticeship. The thing I didn't understand is I was just spending a lot of time copying other people's styles. And that's fine because you're learning how to put story together, you're learning how to deal with character, you're learning how you want writing to function. But what I was doing is I was separating myself from that. I wasn't letting me be a part of the story, probably because that's terrifying in some ways. So, it even though it is fiction, it is drawing on, I suppose, probably particular experiences of depression I've had. I mean, they're not in the story, they're not as I've had them, but what you're talking about of how that feels, I was very much wanted to take how I felt in those moments, whether it's caused by grief or caused by other things, and put that in, give that a narrative to structure that around.
Bereavement can be hard on families, even harder if dealing with it alone. ScotsCare, with qualified therapists, can help navigate the loss of a loved one and help cover the costs of funerals. If you're a Scot in London struggling after losing someone close to you, get in touch with ScotsCare to see if we can help.
Can I talk about you as a person rather than you as a writer? Because one of the other things that I have read about you, and you've been phenomenally candid about receiving an autism diagnosis, but not until you were in your 40s. Now, I suppose there's a lot of questions there in my part. What made you, did you seek that out, or had you been living up to that point thinking something feels different here? How did that come about, Chris?
Yeah, so I'm very, very happy to talk about it. And primarily that's because the only reason I began my quite long and challenging process to getting that diagnosis was because somebody else talked about it. So I had lived for, my life. I mean, really all of it, almost all of it, certainly from really early school years, and then accelerating as I went into secondary school. Lived with problems with anxiety, lived with problems with depression that resulted from that, and had an underlying sense of difference always. I mean, and not in a way that I could probably usefully articulate. So come back to that interest in me finding language to talk about things that are internal and are difficult to talk about. But what started me off is when Chris Packham made his first TV program, which would be 5+ years ago now, about his own diagnosis as being autistic. And before that moment, I mean, it sounds written, it sounds made up, but genuinely, before that moment, I had never once thought, I wonder if I'm autistic. Watching the program was like somebody explaining to me how my brain worked. And it was a real light bulb moment of, oh my God, this is me. Like my experience is so close to him. And I think part of what's interesting there, for me at least, and part of what held me back from getting the diagnosis, may again come to what we talked about earlier about society and how it accepts mental health challenges, but also how it accepts particular health conditions, disabilities, here, neurological differences. The range of autistic experience is so vast, and the common societal stereotypes of what being autistic, sort of what I grew up with in the 80s and 90s, of what being autistic was so incredibly narrow that to hear somebody who I've, watched on TV, loved, I mean, I'm really into nature and bird watching, and that's always been a huge escape for me. But to hear somebody who's so articulate and so fantastic on screen and so passionate describe all these things, I don't think I had a sense that you could be autistic and speak in that way, and be speaking, or primarily mostly speaking, throughout your life. So that started it off, and I then went away, and there's various sort of questionnaires, scoring processes that you can do that give you an indication. They're not conclusive, but they give you an indication of whether you might be autistic or not. And I did a couple of them, and I was off the top of the scale on almost everything. So that began me going through a process of speaking to my GP, but it took years. And I've even had a conversation with the GP who referred me, and back then he referred me. It was rejected, basically because I wasn't, pretty much with because the strain on the NHS, we were told that if I wasn't in a mental health crisis at that moment and wasn't being referred through that route, then they weren't going to look at it. He appealed it, and thankfully they allowed it, and then the process began, which took ages. But he has since told me that if I, with the exact same symptoms, experience, problems that I have, if I applied now, I would get nowhere. I just wouldn't even get looked at because the pressures on the NHS are so extreme. And that's really tough. And my heart breaks for all the people out there who are trying to work out. And it's the same with ADHD. It's the same with other differences, other neurological differences. To the majority of people, getting diagnosis is so hard. And then even if you do get it, any kind of aftercare is non-existent or borderline non-existent.
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, we could spiral off into another conversation, but schools, we've tried with one of our lads to have an educational health plan put in place to try and help him, and he was referred to Surrey Mines, and I think the waiting list there was 2 years. And it's sometimes a lot of the issue is just about we're forcing these kids who have different ways of learning or different ways of acting into this kind of archaic way of educating people. And it just doesn't work, But anyway, Chris, that's another conversation.
No, it really is about. I mean, very, very briefly on it. I mean, I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, it is. There is. We talk about narrow views of things that we hold as societies. We have a narrow view of what learning is. We have a narrow. Not everyone, obviously, but the structures that we build around it, which many teachers are frustrated by as well. But the expectation that learning has to be one thing, the expectation that, I know there's huge issues around the punishment of non-school attendance and the stigmatization of kids and parents around, if your child doesn't turn up, you're lazy, you're failing, whatever. There's such a, and you're fined in England, which is not the case in Scotland. What that's doing for children who just desperately want to learn, but the school environment doesn't allow them, doesn't enable them to. I mean, we could go off for hours and hours. It's makes me so unbelievably angry. And I suppose one final very short point is, if I think about the times when I've struggled the most, it's been around education settings, but there's been other issues as well. But the noise environment of a high school for at least for me as an autistic person, and all autistic people are different, of course, but for me, that noise, that people, the unpredictability of the whole thing, horrific, absolutely horrific. And I only understand now how bad it was, and that was the root of many other challenges.
There's a great infographic. I can't remember. It's by an educationist, a famous educationalist, and he's passed away now. I'll have to dig it out and send it to you. And he does this speech, and somebody draws. It's kind of an animation, and it's talking about how out of date our education system is. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah,
my wife showed it to me. I'll find it and I'll send it.
No, I'd be very interested, and I think just one other thought that you're kind of sparking off in me, that there's even very narrow things. I think about our own daughter being at school, and how we've heard teachers react to, when she's been in classrooms, to different children. Things like, if a child is doodling, that might be the only thread they're hanging on to stabilize their brain so they can listen. So, and then a teacher will say, "Oh, you're not paying attention," or "Stop looking out the window." So there's a real need, and something I'm very interested in. And it comes back to the writing. There's a real need to share more about diversity of experience. And I don't know, as a society, there's some compassion lacking. There's understanding, but there's compassion lacking in times. And I think that's very sad.
Yes. Yeah. You're right. Anywho, Chris, just finally, I'd like to ask you, what happens next for you on the writing? Is there a follow-up to Fray? Are you under contract to write another book?
So I'm not under contract. Fray was a one-book deal, unless you're a big name, which isn't the case just yet, at least. In fiction, you don't tend to get offered more than one book at a time. They buy what they can see. So it's a curious industry, because you have to finish the thing before you're considered. Non-fiction's a bit different. If you've got a proposal on a couple of chapters, you might be able to get a book and a little bit of money to write the rest of it. But I have written a second novel, which is totally different. I'm not connected to the first at all, although I'm still out in nature, and there's still woodland, and there's still similar environments and similar considerations. But that is looking directly at autism. So my diagnosis came after Fray was finished, when we were kind of mid the publication process and working with the publisher. But what I wanted to do with the information that I've gained about myself, and that I'm still constantly seeking out, I'm still learning all the time, because I've lived for 40 years or so without a diagnosis, and I'm now at 2 or 3 with. So there's a lot to make up. But I then want to look at that specifically. So the new book, which is we don't have a publisher for at the minute. We're talking to various different people, and very keen to find someone who gets the issues, is really passionate about the experiences of autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people. But what we're looking at this time is a single family over 100 years. So it's 3 different generations, and they're all the lives of everybody in the book is affected in different ways by autism. So it starts just before the beginning of World War II, which was in turn a few years before the first scientific papers on autism were published, which was mid-40s, and then it runs up to more or less the present day. And the story jumps between the narratives of these different generations and how they've lived in the same place and how they understand themselves, and how, I suppose fundamentally, how society silences people. So there's one character who is non-speaking, but there are others where they're silenced in other ways. They're not listened to by a doctor, by an education setting. They are unable to represent who they are, and I find that as a writer, to then again put that into language, find something that's difficult to articulate, or people ignore, don't listen to then put that on a page is a really exciting thing. So yeah, and then the other part of the book, I suppose, that 100 years, is it also tracks the development. There's a very beautiful forest near where I live, Tentsmuir Forest, just the corner of Fife, just to the north of St Andrews. And that has also been around for about 100 years. So it feels very permanent, but it's something that was planted predominantly between the two world wars, the big push for timber. So kind of plotting how landscape has changed and how this family has changed, but also how as a society we're changing, but maybe not fast enough.
You don't do things by halves, Chris.
I'm let's take that a few different ways. I think if you're gonna, like, extreme would be the wrong word. I think if you're gonna do something, you just give it everything, or you just don't bother. I'm very much of the view that if something's worth doing, you give it everything you've got, or you just let somebody else do it.
That's it.
Instead,
go big or go home.
I'm not interested unless it's difficult and it's going to take me ages to get it right. And then, it can sometimes, hopefully that's driven by, it's also meaningful to other people, because that's the point. That's why I'm doing any of this, and why we're having this wonderful conversation today. It's all about sharing. So if I can do something that connects to another person and makes them feel something, then great. I've done something good. But yeah, you're right. I'm not making it easy for myself, but maybe in there something valuable lies at the end of it.
Chris, thank you for joining the ScotsCare podcast. It's been an utter delight to speak to you. Best of luck.
That's great. Thank you very much.
The Saltire Donor Club is our monthly giving club. Could you spare a monthly donation of any amount to help homeless and vulnerable Scots? Visit our website to give monthly and join the Saltire Donor Club. It couldn't be easier, and it will make a difference to those struggling in London.